Dr. Liboiron is a professor of geography and was formerly the Associate Vice President, Indigenous Research at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Canada. They are founder of the Clear Lab, an interdisciplinary natural and social science lab space dedicated to good land relations, developing feminist and anti-colonial methodologies in the natural sciences to study plastic pollution. And we will get into Clear Lab quite a lot in this session, I hope. And so, Max, would you mind coming in with your voice and saying hello?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dr. Max Liboiron. Uh, it is French. It is tricky. It is all vowels. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am talking to you from Bishop's Cove, which is outside St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in northern Alberta, but I've been living here in Beothuk and Mi'kmaq land for about 11 years now. So this is home now. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I've been sitting with questions of this book for some years now, and it has been so detrimental for shaping how I think about things. It was a kind of interesting story because, as Adam said, when I went to the US for us to facilitate this thing together, I was like, I really want to take any opportunity and free time to go to a bookstore because I have all this list of books I want to buy because they are not available here. But then I arrived in the bookstore and I just bought your book and it wasn't even in my list, but I saw it and I was like, yeah, that's it. It seems like it connects a lot of the things I'm looking for. And so I think it brings up like a lot of things that once you see, you can't unsee. And I think it will do the same for a lot of people in this room. And I would like to start the dialogue right at the title of it because it called my attention through this provocation about the relationship of pollution and colonialism. Can you expand on that? Like, what do you mean with pollution is colonialism?
Oh yeah, that's all. Just explain the yeah. The book isn't really about pollution. The book is about methods, but or like being in the world. But the pollution argument is basically that when you have a dominant system, like colonialism, but also capitalism, patriarchy, there are a bunch of them. Everything is seeped in that system. Everything inherits the logic of that system. You don't get to choose it. It is what makes up what is normal, what is unexceptional, what is common sense, what greases the wheels. And so what that looks like in my context as an environmental scientist, or one of the things it looks like, is the way that actually one of the goals of every environmental, not every, many environmental scientists is to make sure that the environment is not polluted with contaminants at two threshold levels. So current environmental regulation and most of the activism and science around it is about, if how much lead can be in water, 0.01 milligrams per liter or something like that. And so making sure, like monitoring the water to make sure it's below that and looking, and the thing is 0.01 milligrams per liter micrograms per liter is assumes that you can have a little bit of pollution and that human bodies or bodies of water or the land absorbs that amount. It's called the threshold model of pollution. And so pollution itself, the idea of pollution and its relationship dilution, environmental regulation, environmental activism, all assumes access to indigenous land to absorb some harm to make everything else okay. And that is a colonial logic. And my entire field is built on that colonial premise. And that is my inheritance. And as an environmental scientist, an Indigenous environmental scientist, I don't get to be like, nope, I'm going to reject this. I don't get to reject it just because just because it's a shitty inheritance. So the book is all about like, how do you maneuver that really crappy inheritance when you don't have the good options, when like it's colonialism all the way down potentially, like all those sorts of things. So that's why it's a methods book. Why that's why pollution is colonialism is actually a statement about methods, about how, not about what. Um, yeah, we'll stop there maybe.
Yeah, I think you are spot on that. going back to the colonial land relations that are, as you said, normalized, which comes from this entitlement to land, this belief that disproportionate access to global resources is a right rather than a historical privilege built on extraction, oppression, and that discomforts that pollution sustains are not, are seen as the fruits of civilization and development, and everybody should aspire to reach the same level of comfort, even as the world gets cannibalized to sustain it. And I like what you are already bringing about this colonial assumptions, of one of them being the assimilative capacity, like instead of changing systems that are causing harm, trying to come up with technical efforts to manage limits on how much harm is acceptable and how that is the foundation of the permission to pollute system. So from your perspective and experience, what does that difference mean between managing harm and being in good relations with land?
What do you mean? What's the difference between managing harm and being in good relations with that's your question? What's the difference between managing harm and being in good relations?
Yeah, because I think you are pointing to the difference between pollution maybe is not the problem. The problem is the logic behind it. And so
they're both problems.
Yeah, right. If you can expand on that.
You can have lots of problems. It's not a scarcity problem when it comes to problems. So I think mitigating harm and being in good relations are just two different theories of change and two different beings. And I think ways of being. I think mitigating harm can be a way of being in good relations, right? Like there's like nested sort of theories of change and theories of being. I think one of the things that's really important to realize is that colonialism is a land relation. Everything is a land relation. So actually, as I was when you were like, how related or how much in relation are you at work? And I was like, 100%. Some of them are relations you don't like. A lot of them are relations you've inherited. Colonialism is a land relation. Oil is land. It's little crushed up, old, dead, mostly very small biota. That's land that's been like constrained in horrible situations, like your worst, your uncle who went to like residential school and is super fucked up about it. Still your relation, still a relation. It's just maybe a little bit toxic. So the thing about being in good land relations is that it's not universal because of that. If colonialism is land relation and land is different, right? I don't know, mountain relations aren't ocean relations. Colonialism in Kenya isn't colonialism in Canada. And so trying to figure out how to be in good relations is very much a local question. There's not a universal sort of answer to it. It's you start with where you are, you learn the history, and like Anthony talked about like histories and stuff like that. You have to start with where you are. You have to do your homework. Who's already here? Whose land is this? What are the histories of that place? Because it's going to be different if you're in a place with a lot of slavery than if you're a place that doesn't have slavery historically. You're going to be different in a place that had extraction versus not extraction, had settlement versus not. If you're in downtown London, things are different than if you're in downtown Singapore, right? Everything is very, so that's where you start. Yeah, maybe I think we start getting into some of your other questions if I keep going. So let's go back to you, Anna, and you can steer the ship a bit.
Yeah, I think that perspective on context is really, really important. I mean, what called my attention in the book in the first place was that my background is in sustainability, and I found myself increasingly in the situations of, people patting themselves in the back for harm managing, sometimes very poorly, sometimes reproducing problematic patterns, and kind of getting confused or co-opting concepts, etc. And I think the precision in how you name things in the book brought a lot of clarity to me. And one of that things is the differentiation and the precision of how you explicitly say your work is anti-colonial and not decolonial. You are quite deliberate about that. Why? And what is the difference there?
Yeah, so there's another line in the book that I really like that no one talks about, but it's one of my favorite lines, which is like you have to be really specific about your relations if you're in a good relation, because you are both in relation to your mail carrier and your daughter, but you better have different relations with them. You better prioritize them differently. You have different accountabilities, but you're in relation to both of them. So the same thing. So I mean, this also goes what Tuck and Yang talk about in decolonization is not a metaphor, and it's why I differentiate between de and anti-colonialism. You have to be really freaking specific because, like, anti-racism work will not actually deal with colonialism. That's part of Tuck and Yang's argument, for instance. So I come from it, there's different colonialisms, so there's different decolonialisms. It means undoing the very basis of colonialism, which in North America means land back. And that's all it means. And that's the only thing it can mean. So, and some people are in position for land back because land isn't just dirt and bees and trees. It's also the rematriation of our relatives out of museums. It's also rematriation of our data out of repositories, right? That sort of stuff. But mostly it means land back. Anti-colonialism means don't do that. Just don't reach into Indigenous land and life for non-Indigenous goals, needs, and desires. Don't appeal to the commons as a sort of sustainability goal, because that in most places requires access to Indigenous land and life. Don't reach for like enrichment with Indigenous ways of being with the land. Just keep your hands up. Like, so like one of the most important and deep and effective forms of anti-colonialism is just don't. It's self-refusal. Um, yeah. So that's really important. Not speaking on behalf of, not asking for resources, not asking for our time, our knowledge, our ways of, that sort of stuff. Um, One of the primary examples I remember where folks were pro-Indigenous and extremely colonial was during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, when people who were pro-Indigenous would show up with no fucking gear. And Indigenous people had to feed them, and like they had to use our resources to be there to help us protest. And I wanted to be like, blah, blah, blah. So you can, and this is the thing, you can be pro-Indigenous and still colonial because those are two different things. There's a lot of overlap, but it's not a perfect, it's a Venn diagram. So so just being really specific about what you mean. And I think a lot of people know that like decolonial means like everything in the kitchen sink. I saw a proposal the other day for decolonizing opera. If opera can give back land, and I think it could probably, possibly, I don't think that was what was going on though. Yeah, you can decolonize everything in the kitchen sink at this point, which means we would have all our land back by now, and it's not happened, so I don't think it's happening. It is happening some places. There's some places where there's land back, and that is decolonial. And there are actually people working on that, and you should actually check them out because that is the real work. And everything else can probably be anti-colonial.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you brought up. I think that specificity to context, to the obligations are so important because decolonization is a kind of hype, and when a very specific demand like decolonization gets absorbed into this vague posture that can mean whatever is convenient for whoever is using it, and that vagueness allows people to engage with it as a way to forgive themselves for their colonial presence and perform this allyship without any cost, just engaging with this concept intellectually without practicing what they actually require, which is why I think it's so important to have you here as someone who has been living, embodying, and practicing those things and getting your ass kicked a lot by actually proving it is possible to challenge this logic from within the university. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. What does that transformation from within looks like, especially consider what you mentioned in the book about compromise, that I think is also important.
Yeah, here's my compromise slide. This is a quote from the book. Compromise is not about being caught with your pants down, and it's not a mistake or a failure. It's the condition for activism in a fucked up field. And it's not my term. It actually comes from a guy named Hale he was a white anthropologist guy who worked with indigenous nations in courts to get land back, actual decolonial work. And they would strategically, it's called strategic essentialism in the biz. It's basically using racism when you're the person that the racism is about to leverage something else you need. So it's very essentializing and racist to say that Indigenous people aren't Indigenous unless they're on their own land, because most of us are urban. But they would strategically use that argument to get land claims done. So that's compromise, using racism to achieve sovereignty. Sign me up. So yes, I work in a university, and I have been the man in the university. I was an executive administrator. When people complain about the man, that was me. Um, Best place ever to do activism, actually. Sticks and carrots. Have you been an activist and you had carrots and sticks? No, you haven't, because you were not an executive administrator. It was amazing. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wasn't actually, some people say, how do you change the institution from within? I did not change the institution from within. I was making change from within an institution. And those are two very important differences. Very, very important. So there's a guy named La Paperson who wrote a book called The Third University is Possible. And he said, and he uses the word decolonize. He said, I do not want to decolonize the university. I want a university that decolonizes. And I am very much on board. I am not interested in rescuing the university or business or whatever. I am interested in using those resources, using the power of those institutions to give land back, to do harm mitigation, to do other theories of change, because that's where the resources are. And I'm, also the institution isn't interested in being rescued, so I don't have to rescue it. So like that's sorted. Um, any power does not reproduce itself successfully, 100% successfully. It absolutely reproduces itself, but never like cleanly and successfully. So whether it's capitalist or colonial, there are always places where you can leverage that apparatus to reproduce it in different ways. You can leverage funding flows, terms of reference, procurement guidelines, health and safety mandates, bureaucracy, to do specific goods, even when those goods are like weapons of the weak, like foot dragging, self-sabotage, harm mitigation through slowing things down or gumming things up, or all the way to something really cool, um, like like land back, like rematriating human remains out of anthropology and back to nations, for instance. To do that, though, you have to give up your purity politics. You will be filthy. You're already filthy. You have to give up the idea that hypocrisy is like a sign of people being bad. You're a hypocrite. Hypocrisy doesn't actually matter. Saying like, I love women and being a misogynist is the same thing. Don't worry about it. Focus on like doing your chores, not on the rhetoric in those cases. And then you have to learn how the system actually works. If you're in a screwed up field like a university or a business or a corporation or you work for Coca-Cola, the purity politics is like, screw you. You're just evil and I'm just here for my paycheck or whatever. You actually have to learn how that system works well enough to grift it, basically, to make it work for you, to have it churn out things that it wouldn't normally churn out, to like make the flows different. And then the trick is knowing what you're going to reproduce and what you're not going to reproduce. Because the thing about compromise is if you're in a dominant system, you are going to reproduce parts of that system as you make change. There's no way outside of that. That's what dominance means. And so figuring out what you will and what you will not reproduce through the specificity of like, is it decolonial or is it anti-colonial? Is it pro-Indigenous or is it anti-colonial? Like which of those things, that is what guides you through what you're going to reproduce and what you're not going to reproduce, which is why specificity is so important. Yeah, I've been in situations where I have to eat racism to uphold sovereignty. Some Indigenous nations are super racist. Some of them are super anti-Indigenous. So differentiating between pro-Indigenous and sovereignty. Sovereignty means a nation is able to govern itself. And if it wants to govern itself as a bunch of raging assholes, you have to uphold its right to govern itself as a bunch of raging assholes. Right? And so those sorts of choices. Because the problem with that I think some people don't understand about activism and about the how of doing things is it's not usually a choice between good and evil. It's between different and incommensurate goods. And so figuring out how to choose that is really difficult and feels really crappy and is like of the utmost importance. And also you'll get it wrong. And you know how you know that is that your elder or your auntie will smack you upside the head. So that's a very reliable indicator of whether you're in good relations.
Yeah, I think what you are talking about the importance of boundaries in a way, instead of seeking this purity that is impossible and is kind of self-forgiving in a way. This attentiveness to context, to self and others and relations, which is something that I want to go a little bit deeper on, because you bring these good relations as this method, as you said, right? So even from the form of the book itself, through the footnotes, through the clear protocols, even something like returning fish remains to the water as a lab together, as a practice of accountability to land. Can you share a bit more on these protocols, what it was like coming up with them, and how they help you to actually practice good relations and live that out?
Yeah, sure. So I run a lab, Clear, and it's got between 20 and 30 people in it, which is quite large for a lab in the university. And I would say the number one thing that we do is how we hire people. And that's that we hire people on values, not on skills. And then we train them or we change the job or change the project to fit their skills. Because people who have the same values as you, well, first of all, you're just not fighting stupid fights all day long at work. And you can start the conversation like way farther ahead. You can't change someone's values. You can't train them out of values. But you can train them in titration or statistics or whatever you need. And so that has been because we do almost everything collaboratively and we do a lot of things by consensus, having people with the same values in the world in the room, but a lot of other differences, just makes everything better. And we do have a hierarchy. That's actually also very important for the work we do. I have worked in places that don't have hierarchies. Occupy Sandy was one of them, disaster relief and after Hurricane Sandy. Um, I don't like it. I like a good hierarchy and I like being at the top of it. But the reason that Clear has a hierarchy is because we do so much high stakes work, the shit must roll uphill. I must be the final person and the only person that is responsible for when things go wrong. So we just had a junior technician, for instance, make a ton of very impactful mistakes in the data that led to us reporting some things that were not true. And that is my fault. That is not their fault because I put them, they were junior. I knew they were junior. I didn't check their work enough, all that right sort of stuff. So hierarchy should be, when it's operating properly, should be about accountability. Um, yeah. I'm going to assume you had other ideas and things you wanted to talk about from the book in terms of, because like hiring and hierarchy were probably not like the super cool, interesting, juicy things you wanted to talk about. Is there something else, Anna, you wanted to focus on?
No, it is interesting. And I think when I read the book, there were, I think there's three words were there, if I'm not mistaken. Humility, accountability, good relations, which I think for me are feel like really important foundations we need to challenge coloniality. And I think I got the sense from what you share in the book of the lab being this space of fostering an environment where those capacities and skills can be developed, because I think, of course, the things we need to challenge coloniality are not taught or incentivized in the dominant systems that we are in, and that capacity to grow together, support one another, but also challenge one another towards how we are doing the work, not what just the work is. I think you mentioned some examples in the book of how that plays out in practice, of calling one another out, or in those everyday situations. If you could share a little bit more.
Yeah, calling each other in. as opposed to out. Yeah. So probably the most important and useful skill I have is anti-oppressive facilitation, which is not about leading. It's about making sure everything gets on the table and then maneuvering that as a collective. Um, and the anti-oppressive part is really important because business and stuff also has facilitation practices, and anti-oppressive ones are not the same. Um, so, um, blah, 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 blah. How do we do that? We have a lab book that goes through all of these. So calling someone in, like if someone makes a mistake and you have to call them, you calling into it's calling into relations, not calling out for behavior. So like the junior person who screwed up the data, realized they screwed up the data, lost their shit over guilt over screwing up the data, tried to fire themselves and work for free and things that are illegal for under workers' rights. And it was my job to call them back into relations, which was like, I am your boss, you are my employee. That means you have certain rights. It means I take the shit in the face, not you. I hired you. This is what I should have done. This is what you did. Let's identify the things that made these mistakes, that we can identify them. So now this is your new responsibility. Next time you do a data set, that's calling into relations. Um, uh, the when you talked about humility, so the values of the lab, and we refresh our vows with these values every few years. We do it collectively, line by line. Humility means it's humility, accountability, and collectivity. And then good land relations is sort of my shop. Humility means you are always in relation. You are in relation with your mail carrier. Everyone, if you get mail. You are in relation with your daughter, if you have one, whether you have ever met her or not. You are like these are your inheritances. And so humility is being like, yeah, I'm in relation. Accountability is being responsible to those relationships. And so a lot of what we do is accountability work. We don't do blame. We do like trying to fix the thing. There's an entire like apology protocol in the lab because actually no one knows how to apologize properly. This is what I did. This is why it's wrong. This is the harm I caused. This is what I'm going to do differently. The other person doesn't even have to talk. Um, there's also a protocol for writing thank you notes because people don't know how to write thank you notes. You're great. No. I really appreciate how every morning you say good morning because it means I come into work and you help me ground myself into the job, and the job is really important to me and you help me accomplish that. Thank you. One of them is much better as a thank you, right? So these sorts of specificity again is really important in all of these cases. And a lot of what I train people to is in like how do you get specific?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that about the apology. I totally agree with you about we are the dominant culture does not treat us to deal with our mistakes and name the harm, repair the harm, working for that harm to not repeat, and which is this space of accountability, as you were saying, and about learning and growth. And I think this leads me to my last question around getting a bit of updates because the book was written a few years ago, and I imagine there are a lot of things that changed since then. So anything you would change, add, or remove?
No, the book is fine because it's a snapshot in time. It's not my whole practice. We are much further along in the lab. And so I can talk about like some of the things that have changed. That if I were to write the book now, it would be a slightly different book, especially the last chapter, which is about the lab. So one of the probably big lessons I've learned that touches on a lot of things is that no matter how brilliant you are and no matter how innovative you are, listening for the mundane is way more important. Um, an example that has led to sort of what I specialize in now, which is Indigenous statistics and Indigenous science, is we would go into communities we work with the science of like we would look for plastic and we'd be like, here's your number. There's only one number that you present if you're a scientist and you look at plastics in animals. It's called frequency of occurrence. It's the only number there is in the entire biz. And so it'd be like, here's your number. And people would be like, okay, And like 4 months later, it'd be like, here's your number. And people were like, okay. 7 years I showed up and said, here's your number. And people would say K until I was like, K is not really a discussion. I don't think anyone's picking up this number. And it's kind of the only thing I'm showing up, not the only thing I'm showing up with, but it's like the main scientific thing I'm showing up with. And so it took me, and it was correct and it was brilliant. And I'd done some things to that number that were actually quite innovative and heavily rewarded in academia. And it was also completely irrelevant. And one of the things that I really learned, and just by noticing that people did not pick it up, and also the problem of mistaking being hosted and being accepted with having your work picked up. Those are three very different things, and it's hard to tell the difference. It's hard for me to tell the difference. And I came to realize that because I worked with Nunatsiavut and Nunatsiavut Inuit, uh, Inuit and Métis, even though we're both Indigenous, are about as far apart as you can get on the indigeneity spectrum. And our knowledge paradigms are so different. Plus, I'm a colonized Western scientist that like we would never understand each other. And so mutuality and mutual understanding and more meetings and more discussions were off the table as things that were legitimate ways to work together. So if you understand how like knowledge paradigms work, so like Newtonian physics, for instance, which is what you're probably familiar with, gravity is a force. In Einsteinian physics, gravity is a curve on the space-time continuum. You're like, what? Yeah, they don't make sense. Different tools, different measures, what counts as truth, so different. You cannot integrate them, you can't braid them. They don't even live on the same planet. So what if you have someone who's a Newtonian physicist and someone who's an Einsteinian physicist and they have to work together? Well, indigenous knowledge and Western science are even farther apart than that. And so we had to figure out how to work together without me knowing what the fuck was happening, which is a hard position for a scientist to be in. And I could not rely on my brilliance, which is my primary asset, to be clear. It's kind of my, like, by far my primary asset. And I don't always know what else I have to offer. I'm really good at paperwork, actually. So what ended up happening is realizing that just me doing my chores really well and leaving a lot on the table and backing away was actually the most important thing. And we did this whole type of analysis and stuff together. But really the main message was like, listen to the mundane. You don't know what you're doing. Mutuality is off the table. Good luck with that.
Max, thank you so much for your honesty and openness. This was so great. And I think it is a great opportunity to bring everyone into the discussion and also allow some openness for people to jump in and share their own experiences and learnings. But before we do that, anything else you'd like to add?
Actually, yeah, there is one of the questions that Adam put in the little clickety click was, how do you know if you're in good relations? You should be a little bit annoyed all the time. It is like super annoying to get called off whatever path you would prefer to be doing, to get called onto the path of obligation and being in good relations. It is fundamentally annoying. The next book I'm working on is based on the idea that Indigenous spaces aren't amazing because of our big ideas, but because of how we do our chores. It's really about doing your chores. If the apocalypse comes tomorrow, you still have to feed the kids. You still have to walk the dogs. You still have to sweep the floor. And that is the thing that matters. That is activism in a fucked up world.
Thank you, Max, again for bringing all of that in. Adam, should we open the floor?
Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and shift gears here. So first of all, I'm gonna stop the recording.